Hitler's anti-Semitism. Why did he hate the Jews? Anti-Semitism played a major role in Adolf Hitler's thinking and in the Nazi ideology. Read here what inspired Hitler's hatred of Jews and what life events played a role in its development. Hitler did not invent the hatred of Jews. He capitalized on anti-Semitic ideas that had been around for a long time. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. He developed his political ideas in Vienna, a city with a large Jewish community, where he lived from 1907 to 1913. In those days, Vienna had a mayor who was very anti-Jewish, and hatred of Jews was widespread in the city. During the First World War, 1914-1918, Hitler was a soldier in the German army. At the end of the war, he, and many other German soldiers like him, could not get over the defeat of the German Empire. The German army command spread the myth that the army had not lost the war on the battlefield, but because they had been betrayed, by a stab in the back, as it was called at the time. Hitler bought into the myth. Jews and communists had betrayed the country and brought a left-wing government to power that had wanted to throw in the towel. The German defeat was hard to swallow for many Germans, and for Hitler too. In nationalist and right-wing conservative circles, the stab-in-the-back legend became popular. According to this myth, Germany did not lose the war on the battlefield, but through betrayal at the home front. The Jews, Social Democrats, and Communists were held responsible. The prejudices about the role of the Jews in the war were false. An investigation carried out by the German government proved as much. Over 100,000 German and Austrian Jews had fought for their fatherland. Otto Frank, who had fought in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, was just one of them. After the First World War, Germany was in chaos. Once the German emperor had gone, rebellions erupted everywhere. Left-wing groups tried to seize power in many places. In Munich, for instance, a People's Republic of Bavaria was proclaimed during a brief revolution. It provoked a right-wing reaction, which in turn resulted in bloodshed. Hitler was very much impressed by these events. At that point, he was still in the army, and that was where he discovered his oratory talents. Before long, the army had him give training courses, intended to warn soldiers of the communist danger and to stir up feelings of nationalism. In his new role, Hitler got to know the German Workers' Party, the forerunner of the NSDAP. It was the start of his political career. Against the backdrop of revolution and violence, Hitler's anti-Semitism was becoming increasingly radical. It is noteworthy that he said he did not support uncontrolled emotional pogroms, outbursts of anti-Jewish violence. Instead, he argued for an anti-Semitism of the mind. It had to be legal and would ultimately lead to the removal of the Jews. As early as August 1920, Hitler compared the Jews to germs. He stated that diseases cannot be controlled unless you destroy their causes. The influence of the Jews would never disappear without removing its cause, the Jew, from our midst, he said. These radical ideas paved the way for the mass murder of the Jews in the 1940s. Hitler blamed the Jews for everything that was wrong with the world. Germany was weak and in decline due to the Jewish influence. According to Hitler, the Jews were after world dominance, and they would not hesitate to use all possible means, including capitalism. In this way, Hitler took advantage of the existing prejudice that linked the Jews to monetary power and financial gain. Hitler was not bothered by the apparent contradictions in his thinking. He held that communism was a Jewish conspiracy too, as the larger part of the communist leaders were Jewish. Nevertheless, only a small proportion of the Jews were communists. This idea of Jewish communism was to have awful repercussions in the war with the Soviet Union that started in 1941. The population and prisoners of war were treated brutally by the Germans. Hitler viewed the world as an arena for the permanent struggle between peoples. He divided the world population into high and low races. The Germans belonged to the high peoples and the Jews to the low ones. He also had specific notions about other people. The Slavic people, for instance, were cast as inferior, predestined to be dominated. Hitler felt that the German people could only be strong if they were pure. As a consequence, people with hereditary diseases were considered harmful. These included people with physical or mental disabilities, as well as alcoholics and incorrigible criminals. Once the Nazis had come to power, these ideas led to the forced sterilization and killing of human beings. Between 1933 and 1939, the Nazis made life in Germany increasingly impossible for the Jews. Jews fell victim to discrimination, exclusion, robbery, and violence. The Nazis sometimes killed Jews, but not systematically or to kill all Jews. At that point, the main goal of the Nazis was to remove the Jews from Germany by allowing them to emigrate. To encourage them to do so, they took away their livelihoods. Jews were no longer allowed to work in certain professions. They were no longer allowed in some pubs or public parks. In 1935, the Nuremberg racial laws came into force. Jews were forbidden to marry non-Jews. Jews also lost their citizenship, which officially turned them into second-class citizens with fewer rights than non-Jews. In 1938, the Nazis organized pogroms all over Germany. The Kristallnacht, Crystal Night. Jewish houses, synagogues, and shops were destroyed, and thousands of Jewish people were imprisoned in concentration camps. When the war broke out in September 1939, about 250,000 Jews fled Germany because of the violence and discrimination. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Hitler declared a war of destruction on Germany's ideological enemy, the communist regime. The army command was notified that war crimes would not be punished and that they had permission to execute all criminal suspects without trial. By expelling, killing, or starving the population of the Soviet Union, the Germans wanted to create Lebensraum, a colony for Germans. Behind the German military lines, the Einsatzgruppen sprang into action. These were special killing units charged with the task of killing communist officials, partisans, and Jewish men between the ages of 15 and 60. Their actions were officially intended to prevent resistance. From August 1941 onwards, however, the Einsatzgruppen frequently also killed old people, women, and children. Their murders could hardly be considered retaliations. The Jews in the occupied territories were usually ordered to report to a central point, often on the pretext of deportation, or they were rounded up during raids. Then the Nazis would then take them to a remote place where they were executed. In 1941 alone, close to 900,000 Soviet Jews were murdered in this way. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 heralded a new, more radical phase in the persecution of the Jews. The war had made emigration all but impossible. The occupation of Poland meant that 1.7 million Polish Jews were now under German rule. They were housed in ghettos, Jewish housing estates, which looked more like prisons. Several families often shared a single house. They went hungry and lacked medical care. The Jews were not allowed to leave the ghetto without permission, and they sometimes had to do forced labor. Moreover, during the first months of the occupation of Poland, the Germans executed thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish citizens. During this period, the Nazis were planning to deport the Jews from the occupied territories to reservations in Poland or to the territory of the Soviet Union after its planned conquest. An alternative plan entailed deporting Jews to the island of Madagascar. It should be noted that the Nazi plans did not include provisions regarding their accommodation or other living facilities, although they did go into the seizure of Jewish property. This suggests that the Nazis counted on high mortality rates among the Jews. The ideas that Hitler developed in the 1920s remained more or less the same until he died in 1945. What did change is that in 1933, he was handed the power to start realizing them. During the 1930s, he did everything he could to expel the Jews from German society. Once the war had started, the Nazis resorted to mass murder. Nearly 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. By blaming the Jews for the defeat, Hitler created a stereotypical enemy. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the defeated country was still in a major economic crisis. According to the Nazis, expelling the Jews was the solution to the problems in Germany. This political message and the promise to make Germany economically strong again won Hitler the elections in 1932. After he had come to power, the laws and measures against the Jews increased all the time. It ended in the Holocaust, the murder of innocent Jews.